Thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation and for the presentation. So I'm very happy to be here and to be able to talk to you a little bit about our experience of identifying practical applications in neuroscience research. And here's a bit of a summary of my talk this morning. I'm going to do a brief introduction, talk a bit about the work we do in the lab, and then we're going to go about the subject of the webinar. So I'll start with these pictures because they quickly tell you about my background. I'm an MD and I'm trained as a pediatrician. And I specialized in neonatal follow-up. And this specialty is, I find it fascinating. It's focused on neurodevelopment. And we literally follow up children that were exposed to a difficult starting life. So typically they are graduates from the neonatal intensive care unit. And the goal is to identify early identification of hurdles and prompt establishment of services like physiotherapy, OT, speech and language pathology that can help these kids thrive at school. And at the same time, I'm a neuroscientist. I've done my master's and PhD in neuroscience, exploring the long-term effects of perinatal adversity in brain and behavior, using animal models and focusing on molecular and developmental neurobiology. So you see here in the pictures what was my life since med school up until recently, bouncing back and forth between these two worlds, seeing my patients very early in the hospital and then rushing to the lab to run experiments, back to the outpatient clinic. So that characterized my training and early professional years. So despite being extremely busy, I feel very privileged in a sense because my whole understanding of the scientific method and approach and application was very natural because it happened in this context. And here's my lab today, to which now I'm full-time devoted. And we continue focus on these long-term effects of the early environment on behavior, brain development and risk for disease, with the overarching goal of identifying vulnerability early, where interventions are more effective. And this is the only piece of scientific data I'll bring to you today, just as an example of what we do. So the effect that we see in different human samples looks a lot like this. Here we are looking at anxiety problems at 6 years of age in our Canadian bird cohort called MAVEN. And you see clearly that children that were raised in the red part of the x-axis facing increased levels of adversity have increased levels of anxiety. And this effect is very consistent across multiple samples and also several mental health outcomes and physical outcomes as well, and is aligned to a vast amount of studies in the literature. So we know that like stress leads to an increased risk for developing psychopathology and physical diseases in humans. And this is an example in children. Now we can also note on this plot the large variability that exists in the response. So while several children exposed to adversity have high levels of anxiety, several of those exposed have normal levels compared to those not exposed. So you see that some children are more vulnerable and some are more resilient. And today in medicine, this is a very large problem because all our programs for prevention, early detection, interventions, they're all based on the history of exposure. And as we see here, some of these exposed children would need to receive specialized follow-up because they do develop the problem, but others don't, they wouldn't need the support. So you imagine that if we could have markers that helped us identify true vulnerability and not base all our programs solely on the history of exposure, we could save a lot of resources and effectively offer services and support to those that really need the support. And what my lab does is to create biomarkers that can help us identify who's in fact vulnerable, as I showed you here. So Here we created a polygenic marker informed by functional gene expression data from relevant animal models. So using a pipeline invented at my lab, we can directly apply the molecular neuroscience data that is produced in basic science in animal models to the human condition, and indeed detect true vulnerability. So this is an example of a study done in my lab, but in fact, we have done this in different contexts using different biomarkers, diverse animal models, and studying a large range of outcomes. So our lab has created this novel approach to genomic profiling based on biological function of the genes, and it aggregates genes into networks, considering their levels of co-expression, and enables a new approach to create this, what we call expression-based polygenic risk score. So in this process, we also established expertise in several different pipelines for advanced functional genomics and for multi-level analysis using different biomarkers, not only genetic markers, but other markers as well, peripheral markers, to really identify risk. Specifically about the EPRS, this is a very brief summary of the work, but we start by identifying co-expression networks, so genes that work together in a biological process, using RNA sequencing that tells us about the expression of these genes in a specific tissue. We can create or identify these networks. Then we apply a series of pipelines, bioinformatic analysis to transform the information from a gene network into a score that can be calculated in different samples. So the novel part of the technique is that we're not talking about one genetic marker, but in a technique that defines individual variation in a certain biological process in a specific brain region using hundreds of markers. And the technique transforms the static genetic data, and I say static because we all know that all cells from our body have the same DNA, so it doesn't change independently of where you collected the sample, which is nice for some reasons, but also static in other reasons because it doesn't tell you anything about the tissue or how that organ is functioning. So using the pipeline, we actually transform this static data into a tissue-specific score that tells you about the function of that tissue or of that gene network specifically there. And the scores have also been demonstrated to be consistent and stable across different ancestries, which is impossible with the classical GWAS-derived polygenic scores. So, of course, this was very interesting for our own research purposes and questions and hypotheses. But in the process of, discussing the results and the research in different venues, there wasn't this exponential increase in interest, and many different people came to us and interested in the technique. Local colleagues from our institution, other colleagues in Canada, and then in different parts of the world. So we got to a point in which we have more requests than our capacity to effectively handle them. And this strongly supports the notion that this is an idea that can be applicable to different fields and be helpful to different needs in research. And so it identified or helped us see that there was a niche for a need that needed to be attended. So you see in the plot here, we started in 2017 with the first, that's when we created the technique. And what we're showing you here is the number of scores that were calculated, both inside the lab for collaborators, and you see how it grows, like a bit limited by our own capacity, but it shows the interest that was increased and continue increasing to date. So with the support from Neurosphere here, we are in the process of increasing capacity for tech transfer, and we are in full expansion right now. And that's the point where you see that your lab is generating something that goes beyond your own research field and your own questions. And it's fascinating. It's overwhelming sometimes, and a bit scary sometimes as well. The main difference to me, like I'm a scientist, like never had interface with other domains, but the main difference to me is the changing speed between academia and more, corporate business world, which is something that us as scientists have to learn to navigate. And I brought a few points like to tell you that I think were important for my lab in this process of identifying something that can be applicable or interesting to other scientists and perhaps other professionals as well. And the first point I'm bringing to you is this one. So the research question of your lab genuinely being linked to a need. So we all know about this, like we write papers and grants, and I brought a little example here of a paper that several of our papers and grants starts this way. Depression is a major epidemiological concern and the prevalence is very high, or could be depression, could be type 2 diabetes, could be cardiovascular disease. We always start our grants and papers saying, oh, this is a big problem because the prevalence is very high. But then let's say your lab is focused on a very small cut from the whole big problem. And yes, of course, it is important and it contributes to the large need. But if your research questions and hypothesis is more, it's closer to a real need, I think it becomes easier to promote innovation and to have an idea that will be applicable to different fields. So it's not, that lip service that you say, okay, this is very prevalent and I'm working with this, that it's somewhat related to this disease. No, you generally think about your research question and the hypothesis that can effectively contribute practically to solve the problem. Yeah, again, on this, along with these lines, there's also this, sometimes there's this habit of searching for something that is hot in science, right? I'm doing this and this is very hot. Everybody's publishing on this. So then you create the need of your, for your research. So you justify your research based on the need, which is a bit upside down, the way to address science, right? The other point that I find important in this process is that I call the several times of translation. We have an idea that knowledge translation, for example, is something that when you translate scientific findings and knowledge to the community. But in fact, translation has several times, and I like this figure because it tells you that it comes from the bench to bedside, as we know, but then from the bedside to the community and back to the bench. It's a circle that feeds each other and never ends. So the capacity to navigate with ease from one place to the other is helpful and needed in this process of finding an idea that can be applicable to different fields. So going from basic science to clinical science to epidemiology to the application, the community and to professionals and back to start is an interesting exercise. And of course, there are other things that you need to in order to do this, and I'm gonna tell you about that. Of course, the first thing is having a multidisciplinary team. And I'm lucky to tell you that I always had students from different backgrounds. So we work in medicine, but we always had students from nursing, physical education, basic biology, pharmacology, dentistry, even musicians I had in my lab. So when you live in this environment, if the message makes sense to your heterogeneous lab members, it will make sense to a broad audience. And probably it will be highly applicable to different fields. So you can kind of experience or test your idea in people from different backgrounds inside your own lab. And also this helps you developing skills to explore and explain the idea in different ways. So for someone that comes from dentistry, the technique has to make sense in that context. But for someone from physical education, it has to make sense in a bit of a different context. So as you manage the group, you are in this constant exercise of seeing different aspects of your own line and bringing that to your students and colleagues. Now, I emphasize here, okay, having a multidisciplinary team is extremely important, but a multidisciplinary team working together is very important. And the emphasis is because often in a lab or in an organization, people will group the different expertises in small subgroups to improve productivity, right? Or make things happen faster. And yes, it works in the short term because, you know, people that have the same expertise understand each other and can, you know, quickly make something happen. But the thing is that this delays innovation, right? You have to spend the time to be together with your colleagues that don't necessarily speak the same technical language as you, but this time spent together and effort to understand each other, to go to meetings where sometimes you don't fully get everything, or to journal club presentations where you kind of lost. But in this process, in the longer term, that's where the team grows, and crossing this expertises, that's where, at least in my lab, that's where we see innovation being born. The price that as a scientist often we pay is that it may take time to be accepted. Whenever you have a new idea or you're crossing something, genomics with, I don't know, neuroimaging, or, you know, crossing different fields, you have some sort of consequences. Like it may take time to have your paper accepted, or you may have to try in different places, or the journal that you send your paper, for example, doesn't have the expertise to review this because it's so multidisciplinary and has so many levels that sometimes you're not reviewed with fairness. The same thing for grants, for example. So there's some sort of resistance whenever you innovate, but you have to, again, spend the time and hopefully have the resources to thrive despite a bit of resistance that you can find. Now, preparing this to you and thinking about these things, I realized, okay, innovation is an exercise of humility. And the reason why I think that is that in the process of explaining your idea to different people from different backgrounds a million times and trying to, you know, win this resistance that you find, you have to be ready to improve your idea, to reflect upon what you have, and not to be convinced, okay, what I have is the best thing in the world and you have to accept me no matter what. No, every time you find a bit of resistance, you can stop and think, and okay, yeah, I could really improve that part. We're good, but we're actually not covering this part of the idea, for example. So being able to do this exercise of reflecting and saying, yeah, our limitations are these ones, and trying to find ways to address and improve is very important and essential to make your idea more applicable to these different fields. Again, I'm emphasizing the same point with the notion that one knows everything, and especially when you're working in a multidisciplinary team and in the interface between different fields, the more innovative and multidisciplinary you are, the more you are dependent on the various expertises that you have inside your lab or your network or your group. So, you know, some fields or some professionals are more resistant to work with others and to admit that you need other people to help you than others. And we know that often scientists, and I can speak about that because I work in science, we want, like, we are there on the bench working alone and, you know, having our own little team and focusing on one thing. But the more you integrate, you have to recognize, okay, I know this and I'm very good at this, but I need help for that. And being able to do that, again, is very, very important. So the last thing and the message, I think that I would like to end my point here is that techniques should be used as instruments to answer your research question, to test your hypothesis, and not as the purpose of your lab. So we all know that, like, to thrive in science, you have to publish well, you have to have funding, and you have to continue having, you know, an impact. So I already mentioned to you about, you know, what's hot in science, let's use this technique, but it shouldn't be like that. Even the process of selecting people, you know, for working in your organization sometimes is based on the technique that the person knows, not so much about the research questions or hypotheses that the person has. So it's a lot of fireworks, that's why you have the figure, but not necessarily substance, right? So creating the need based on the technique is kind of the opposite of what the scientific method proposes. So this is something for us to think about. And I think that as you more and more see the techniques that you have as instruments to answer hypotheses, the more your techniques can be applicable to other fields and to other hypotheses, to other questions. And then your science becomes more broadly applicable. And that's it. I brought my lab again because they are really the actors of this show, and I'm very grateful to work with an amazing group of students and staff and collaborators and funders as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Patricia, for your insight. It was all very extremely interesting. So yeah, as you told us, going from fundamental research to application can be very overwhelming. You had to know how to work with an interdisciplinary team and learn, like, how to speak a new language and the same language with everyone, and learn new skills as well. So I will let people ask questions. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate if anyone has questions.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Okay, so maybe I have one question. So from all the skills that you had to learn, like going from fundamental research to application, what was the hardest one to learn and to apply? Which one was the most overwhelming to learn?
Yeah, good question. I think that this process of putting different people together in your team and keep the interest of everyone, despite the fact that sometimes you focus more on this expertise, sometimes more a bit on the other side. So I think that's the hardest thing to learn, how to keep the entire team interested in the larger goal and the longer term goals. But yeah, I think that's also very essential for this process.
Yeah, and also you said that there needs to be a need for application, which is sometimes different from fundamental research where you just do research. And while if you want to commercialize an innovation, it's not going to work if there is no need. So could you emphasize more about this? Like how did you know that there was a need, like a real need for your innovation?
Yeah, that's great, Sarah. And I actually, the plot that I show with the increased requests of calculation for the scores, I think I was kind of caught by surprise with that. It sparked so much interest for so many people from different fields. We actually first have people interested, and then we're now rushing to build capacity to attend to this kind of quote unquote clientele that appeared. So again, I think we're lucky in a way, because it was an idea that many people got it and thought that could be applicable to their own reality. But I think the reason for that is, as I said, is that it was born from a real need. We really want to try to find things that help us identify risk. And in this process, then you create something that can be useful for other people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Patricia, again. Now, oh yeah, there's a question. Sure.
Thank you for the thank you for the beautiful presentation. You mentioned that being a clinician is a privilege to identify the clinical needs. So for somebody that it's so for example just in neuroscience and doesn't have any clinical background, so what advice would you give such person in order to kind of identify the research problems that would be clinically relevant?
That's an excellent question, and I think that the one thing that can be helpful in this sense is to work with colleagues that are outside your field. So, for example, if you're a basic neuroscience, to work in close collaboration, or to have someone that is a clinician or is working in the community, that is very different from what you do at the bench there, but it can give you the ideas and spend the time again to interact with your colleagues from very different fields. Talk to them about your own research, and do the exercise of explaining this in a language that can be assessed by the other field. And these collaborations can, one, give you lots of amazing ideas and help you identify needs as well.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Patricia. But if you think of anything else, there will be another Q&A session afterwards. So don't hesitate or write them in the chat and we will answer them later. So now I'm going to introduce our second speaker, who is Chris Cockery. So he works as a technology transfer manager in the Office of Innovation and Partnership. So I had the opportunity already to introduce the INP during my introduction to Neuroscience. So we work in very close collaboration with INP, and so Chris actually works on guiding researchers towards successful commercialization of their innovation. And so he's going to share with us how a tech transfer office helps researchers in that matter, and how they can push towards application and potential commercialization. So Chris, the floor is yours.
So as Sarah said, I'm a technology transfer manager, and couple of the things, the main thing that I do with that is help push inventions that have happened at McGill, however, whatever sort of IP it is, out to use in society. Part of the mandate of any public institution, public research institution, is to ensure that the research that is discovered and developed at that institution is available for use in the world and in the country that pays for that research. And so most universities have a technology transfer department, and they run at a deficit. They're designed to, which makes me slightly nervous every time I bring it up, because I was I worked for a couple of different companies, small companies that I founded in my life, and it feels awkward to run at a deficit, but it's what we're supposed to do. And today what I'm going to talk to you about is how translatable IP can be discovered in your lab, in your research group when you're doing research, and then the mechanisms that are in place at McGill to help you make sure that that world gets moved out into the world. Everything from the style of example that Patricia gave, where she developed a new methodology that is very attractive and interesting to people in the world and can be simply provided to them, to people who develop a new drug that could be any sort of therapeutic medication and the ridiculously expensive process that is required to get that translated into the world, to the development of styles of doing things. We deal with plants occasionally. Someone breeds a new strain of plant, and in order for that to be picked up by the growers' markets, they need that protected in some way through plant breeders' rights, so that we can give those plant breeders' rights to, or sell them to, a company that produces a huge number of seeds that then sells those seeds to the farmers. All of these developments that happen at McGill are different kinds of IP, and the way that they get moved out into the world is very different. So I'll talk really in two parts today. The first part here is about determining what is inventive or intellectual property. And intellectual property has got a very broad definition that I'll get to shortly. And then I'll focus a little bit on patenting, because many companies are not interested in actual intellectual property where they cannot convince or legally require some other company from not using that work. And so that's what patents do. But the way that a patent gets licensed can be across a broad variety of things, from a specific exclusive license. This is the only company in the world that's allowed to do this, through to open source licenses where everyone who wants can do this, but no other company is allowed to start selling it because we get to sell it. There's a whole host of ways to do this. And it's important to realize that there's not specific points between patents and open source. There's a full grayscale between all of them. And intellectual property protection strategy, which is something I deal with a lot, is figuring out what is the right point for this particular type of invention along that grayscale. And then the second half of what I'll talk about is sort of how the technology transfer office at McGill works, how you can reach out to us, what we do, what's involved in some of the technology transfer activities we undertake, and then how things move on to commercialization, and how there is the expectation of inventors who wish to translate their inventions to be involved. Because remember, Patricia pointed out how there's a very cyclic nature to that idea of knowledge translation. It goes around and around and around many times. companies that are interested in your inventions are not really specifically interested in your invention. They're interested in what you, the researcher, does and how their company can benefit from a collaboration with you, that researcher. So that's an important, actually that's quite an important aspect of what my office does, is ensure that those collaborations develop and grow to make sure that it comes with support for your labs, of course, but to make sure that the process is continuing as opposed to a single time transfer. All right, so intellectual property is legally defined as any product of human intellect, and that is currently in question. South Africa recently awarded a patent to an inventor who was an AI. But currently the definition is any product of human intellect that is unique, novel, non-obvious, and valuable. It's uniqueness just means that it's not out there already, and it's a fairly hand-wavy definition. But the three definitions that are quite important to my office and the US Patent and Trade Office and things like that are, is it novel? I.e., is it something that you could publish? That's a simple way of looking at novelty. Is it valuable? Is it something that is worth protecting in some way? Because there are a lot of things that are interesting information that are not necessarily valuable information, and that's okay. And is it non-obvious, which is terribly difficult to figure out. You're not allowed to protect something at a patent office. You're not allowed to claim something as intellectual property if it is alluded to by two other ideas. Say, painting numbers on cars, putting license plates on cars to identify them is a well-known construct. And I always think of a new example every time I give any talk like this, and it takes me a moment because I don't want to use an old one, that's cheating. Say we invent flying cars. Someone can patent the flying cars, but the act of putting license plates on flying cars, even though it's never been done before and is a valuable thing to do, isn't non-obvious, because there are already pieces of knowledge there in society that do not require an inventive leap to realize that license plates on flying cars are also a useful option. The real trick that a lot of inventors get disappointed with when we look to whether or not we can protect something is we search through all of the patents and all the literature that is there and try and determine if there is that interdigitization of ideas between one publication and another publication. And publication A suggests method A, and publication B suggests the need for solution B, and using method A to get to solution B is unfortunately not inventive, because those two publications have each taught that that can be used in that way, and therefore the human intellect that very definitely produced something novel and valuable did not produce something inventive. Publication A told them how to do it, and publication B suggested they should do it. Now, if publication A doesn't tell you very well how to do it, and you have to change the way publication A suggests in order to arrive at solution B, then that is inventive. But if you just follow the steps in publication A, you don't have something that can be, that is true intellectual property, is truly protectable. The rest of this slide tells you about all sorts of different kinds of intellectual property. Know-how is probably the most valuable thing that McGill has. It is the reason that companies want to come and talk to you in an iterative basis. They want to talk to you again and again because your knowledge as researchers is far more valuable to them than your patents or your copyrights or things like that. It's what can be realized in the future with careful planning is definitely the value in knowledge translation. But that can't be protected. And so the things that can be protected tend to be patents, copyrights, trademarks, things like that. Additionally, plant breeders' rights, but we very rarely do that, but it happens. An important thing that I like to bring up about patents. People think that a patent gives you, and only you, or only whoever has the rights to the patent, permission to do that thing. That is not the case at all. All a patent does is it gives you permission to require that someone else does not make money off of that thing. And that's an important distinction. What it does is it in the large big pharma situation, it prevents someone else from taking it takes like $100 million to take a drug and develop it all the way to market. And if a company wants to spend $100 million in that development, they don't want someone to make a generic for $2 million of preparation and start selling it. They feel they have been ripped off. And realistically, they've been undercut in a way that makes them uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable how much they then charge for this drug, but that's a different problem. And that's a problem that can be addressed with different methods of medical treatment in different countries. Anyways, we aren't going to get to that today. I'm sure that's a discussion we'd all like to have, but it's not something we have time for. And so in generally, all you're doing is you're protecting your right to sell or commercialize that. But no one is ever requiring you to enforce that. For example, recently, NASA developed a mathematically fuel-efficient way to get to the moon that is better than what we've currently been doing. And they patented it, and then they made it public. And they said, we're not going to let anyone else, or we're not going to keep anyone else from using this method. Go to town, enjoy yourselves. We're just making sure that one of the companies in the hands of the billionaires in the States does not patent this method and then try and keep other people from doing it. We're actually patenting it to make it open source. And that happens fairly commonly. And that's an interesting way to protect your right to do something as well. You don't have to keep other people from doing it. It just means that other people cannot keep you and anyone you want from doing it. And that's valuable to understand that difference. 3 types of patents that occur. The only one that McGill will ever file, except for a very rare patent, is utility patents. Those are patents to use something. We're not interested in design patents where I made this chair look more aesthetic. I made it so that the shape of my mouse cursor is more appealing to the human eye. McGill's not interested in that sort of knowledge development. We can leave that to companies with too much money. But the things we do like to patent are ideas that can be not necessarily sold, but would be valuable to a company who's interested in investing in the researcher. If the company would like that to be protected so that they feel safe, then we will patent it and we'll commercialize it to them. And they will often then set up some sort of research agreement that provides research money to the lab that developed that IP. And the other thing that McGill does is we ensure that the inventors who are students who come and go through your labs or through the labs are also rewarded financially in some way if they invented something. They're not going to get anything 5 years down the road if the only research interaction or the only interaction McGill has with that company is additional research funding into the lab they worked in. So we ensure that there's a method where the students and the PIs who were involved in that invention get some compensation. I'll get to that later. A good way to look at whether or not things can be patented is if you expect within the next year to reduce that idea to practice. So if you have something that you think is an idea that is potentially valuable to the world, and valuable I don't mean in terms of cash, I mean in terms of use. It would be useful for the world to have access to your idea. And you think that you will have that reduced to practice within the coming year, talk to my office. Our preference is that you've just reduced it to practice for the very first time. It's not ready to publish yet, but that's your first success. You're pleased with it. I remember a time as a postdoc where I was sitting in a quiet, dark room by myself, measuring the surface energy of something I've made. And I looked at this astounding result that was better than I know had been seen before. And it did end up getting patented. And I definitely looked around and raised my fist in excitement. And then I looked around to make sure no one was looking at me and politely wrote down my notes and went beetling down the hall to go and tell my supervisor how good these surfaces we'd thought of were. And it's when that happens that our office would like to hear from you. That's the time. You're starting then to prepare a manuscript because you're quite excited about it. And you realize that there's a whole bunch more work to do to even realize a good publication, but we can start looking at whether or not it's something that we can translate out into the world. So that's the time to let us know. All right, and then if you're letting us know, what is it that a technology transfer office does? And as I've said before, our job is to make sure that the inventions, any IP that happens at McGill that should or could benefit the world or should be translated out into the world gets moved out into the world. There are lots of personal reasons why you might want to do that, but in the years that I've done this, 99% of the reasons that researchers want something used in the world is because they're proud of what they've done and developed, and they see the value to it to the world, and they would like help convincing the world that there is value to what they've done. And it's simply that true altruism, thankfully. It's nice to work in a job where I see altruism once in a while. Often, actually. It's that idea that is the main reason I find that people want to do that. But there's some other benefits. There's industrial money that will come into your research lab. There's potentially financial reward for students who've invented something. Depending on your faculty, it's sometimes part of your criteria for promotions. But in general, it's the fact that you've done something useful and would like to get it to society. And that's McGill's stance on that as well. That's what we're looking to do. We aren't looking for McGill, or no offense, yourselves, to get particularly rich because of some invention that you had. We're looking to make sure that the ideas and the invention that you've had gets to be used in the world, and that you get known for it. That would be lovely. That would be our intention. And so that involves everything from when you first approach my office with this eureka moment that you've had, all the way through to signing some license deal with a large company, or signing a sponsored research deal with a large company, or I've founded a couple of different companies myself. And so one of the reasons that I have the position I do is I help students who are finishing their graduate degree and have invented something, spin that off into a startup and actually form their own company and try and have a go at it that way. And that's remarkably rewarding until you have small children, and then it's phenomenally busy. And so I stopped doing that. And then I expect it would get remarkably rewarding again once my children are old enough that I can sleep at night. But until then, it's a lot of work. Be aware of that. But it's quite a rewarding thing to do, to sort of steer that yourself. And Patricia mentioned the fast pace of industry. Industry is remarkably fast paced compared to academia. And that's a thing to be aware of. So anyways, we'll help you through all of the stages that happen there. And there are different individuals on the team that I'm part of who have expertise in different areas of that translation and are happy to do so. So in general, at universities, technology transfer consists of research that occurs, and then I can't know when you've had that lovely fist pump moment of success in your lab. You have to tell us. So then you report that to us as a report of invention, and we'll assess it. We'll decide whether or not it's actually, we'll start to talk to you about protection strategy. And protection strategy is not McGill's choice. It's a joint choice between the owners, who are McGill, and the inventors, how we'd like to do that. And whether you want to exclusively license this to a drug company, or to have something open source available, but that is safe so that no one else can start selling your open source, and everything in between. And it's the way you'd like to do that, with the awareness, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide, with the awareness that this stage here, this reporting the invention, is always 100% the inventor's choice. If you simply want to publish that and have it available in the world for anyone who wants to use, perfect. That is McGill's main mandate, and I support that. And if you want to try and work to commercialize that in different ways, then you can report the invention to my office and we'll figure it out. And that the culmination of that is licensing it either to a startup that's found, or licensing it in some way to license recipients, whether that's open source or simply putting something openly to the world so that they can use it. And the commercialization aspect, which is that iterative process again that Patricia mentioned, where you help make sure that whoever is using it uses it well, and any new developments that you have along those lines get incorporated into its application in society. So at McGill, we do all of these things. Sarah's going to give you all of these slides after the presentation. So I'm not going to read you my slides because no one wants that. Patricia goes with a very sparse slide style, which I love. Thank you very much. I put too many words on some slides, but I'm not going to read them to you. But McGill does all of those things as well and is happy to help you do so. The structure, I see a chat question. Is that for me? No.
Yes, I think it was for you, Chris. Yeah.
So yes, why did they not just publish it? So that's an excellent question about why NASA decided not to publish it. And I'm a bit curious about that myself. And so I looked into it. And the reason that they actually didn't publish that orbit of the moon is, or orbit to the moon, is because they wanted to sort of stylistically put their foot down and say, look at this. This is a better way to do this. And we want everyone in the world to do this. So realistically, what they did, Yanis, is they wasted $8,000 or however much they paid for a US patent, which would cost McGill about $8 grand. They wasted $8 grand to sort of put their foot down in a statement saying, the right thing to do for space travel is to make sure that it's accessible to everyone and not try and restrict it using our patenting laws. And I support that because NASA certainly has enough money to do that. If you were a small startup or a researcher, or McGill, for example, our advice to you would be, don't patent that and then immediately release the patent. Instead, publish it widely, talk about it, make sure there's a news article that comes out about it. And then they're never going to be able to make that non-obvious criteria that would allow someone else to patent it. So that's spot on, Yanis, that idea that you don't have to patent something and then say, look, we're never going to prosecute it. You can publish it to make sure that the whole world is aware of it, and then it's not a patentable thing, because it does not involve an inventive leap to do what NASA politely told you to mathematically do to get to the moon. So really, they're making a statement more than they're interested in having a patent. And I expect they're politely going to pay their few thousand fees of maintenance on that patent just to continue making that statement. So there's your answer to that. But yeah, there's not a huge difference between patenting a patent and then saying you're never going to prosecute it and publishing it so that it's not patentable for others. You just have to make sure that the publication is very careful in stating exactly what could be done so that no one can argue that there was an inventive leap between what was in your publication and what was mathematically or what was done in actually getting to the moon on less fuel. A thing to be aware of too, and maybe a reason they did this, is some patent offices in the world lean on the prior art of patents more than they lean on the prior art of publications. My guess is that NASA probably also published it, that they put in a publication and they put in a patent, and they made sure that everyone in the world was aware that NASA has confirmed this as free for all time, well, for functionally for all time for people based on our patent laws. Anyways, this is the Office of Research and Innovation. Martha Crago is the VP. The Innovation and Partnerships Office, which is INP that Sarah showed you about before. Benoit Boulet is the brand new Associate VP. I've met him once. He seems nice. The director is Mark Weber, and then the head of the Technology Transfer Unit is Olivia Novak, and that's the unit that I'm part of. So what are the things McGill patents? I said this before. We'll file utility patents based on several different things. The likelihood of commercial success, how strong the patent claims will be. Every claim is examined individually in a patent, and if we can't get most of the claims we'd like to make through, it's often not worth our money, because as I've said, we're a research institution interested in disseminating knowledge to the world, not interested in making ourselves rich on the 2 or 3 claims we managed to get through, if we were to do so. Our freedom to operate, which means that there aren't too many other patents that are in the way, and the inventor participation. There are some inventors who are like, I'd like to patent this, and then never think about it again. And companies are actually interested in you, the researcher, not the patent, not the piece of paper that they could hold. We're less interested in patenting things in that situation. But if the research team in some way, or some people on the team, want to get involved in trying to market that, my office is much more likely to want to patent it, because it's much more likely that we'll be able to get a company interested. And then finally, we do file patents so long as they meet at least a couple of the above criteria, specifically the strength of patent claims. We don't throw money away when we know that claims aren't going to work. But if there are grant requirements that require you to have something patented, then McGill also strongly looks in favor of doing that. We'll risk the few $1,000s it takes to provisionally patent something in order to apply for a healthy, substantial grant. And realistically, just convince our office, and we're happy to do so because, as I said, we're allowed to run at a deficit. And when we do well, that money doesn't go to anyone when McGill makes it. It goes back to researchers. The McGill Innovation Fund, which was announced this year. Last year, we had a banner year and had some surplus. And so $500,000 is going back to researchers so that the research to develop new technologies gets funded internally by McGill with no strings attached. It's a fairly cyclic nature, where think of us as a nonprofit that's usually in the hole. All right. Oh, so McGill's IP policy is run by the Senate, and the Senate put out several documents, and I'll send them, there's a link in a couple of slides to them. But basically, once you report an invention to our office, well, first of all, you have your first choice, whether or not you want to report the invention, as I said. And then choice 2 comes after you choose to report an invention. You can decide who's in charge of commercialization. The inventors and McGill both have rights to this patent because of the way that McGill governs intellectual property. And the inventors can assign all of their rights to McGill so that we can sign it off and license it and commercialize it. We'll also pay for all the patenting costs and things like that. Or if the inventors prefer, McGill can assign the rights to the inventors, and the inventors can put all of the money into protection that they wish to and figure out how to commercialize it themselves. That's rarer because it's a lot of work. And if you don't know how, it's tricky to do well. But it happens often in cases where the inventor is already part of a company and they wish to translate this new invention into their company as well. And then it's easier to just assign rights to the inventors, and then the inventors set up a deal to the company. However, the inventors still have to get McGill's approval to do that. They're not allowed to just give it to the company for nothing because there may be some students involved in that invention process who we don't want to get ripped off. And those two choices come with different amounts of remuneration or revenue for the researcher and McGill. If McGill does the work and pays for things, then McGill gets 40% of the money that comes in. If the researchers do the work and pay for things, McGill gets 20% of the money comes in. McGill still gets some of the money because the powers that be at McGill have decided that the environment McGill created for you and hired you into and things like that beget some sort of remuneration should you invent something that starts to make you wealthy. Anyways, all of the information about that can be found in these 4 hot links. And so once Sarah sends this presentation out to you, you can feel free to look through them and figure out what you'd like. The 3 here, well, the policy on inventions and software and the policy on copyright are Senate documents. The guide to the policy on inventions and software is simply instructions on how to read the policy on inventions and software, which is thick legalese. And the guide to faculty inventors is actually much easier to read, and it's just an online web form that I recommend as a good place to start. All right. So I mentioned the process of invention disclosure and when to disclose. When to disclose is when you have that eureka moment before you have published a manuscript, but the manuscript is starting to shape up, because we actually need to use the content of that manuscript to assess whether or not we can move forward with protecting it in some way. We need to know enough about the invention to be able to assess its non-obviousness, really. So anyways, in that first section here, it takes however many weeks it takes you to make a disclosure in the online portal. Currently, the online portal has crashed spectacularly. So just email me and I will give you a Word document that you can fill out, which is the exact same questions as in the online portal. And then you can email it back to me and I'll do a bunch of extra work myself because it's crashed spectacularly and I'm thrilled. The company who wrote it is working on fixing it. I assume they own the IP. Anyways, then that disclosure that you make to us becomes a report of invention, and I or some other tech transfer manager will meet with you to have some questions to make sure that this is, to make sure what you would like done in terms of commercializing that. And at the same time, we'll initiate a 3-month due diligence review process that aggressively examines whether or not we actually have the space to operate, whether this is a non-obvious invention that we should put money into, or whether we should look towards other ways of protecting and managing that IP. And then if the inventors wish, and if it passes this due diligence review, then we can file a provisional patent application. And if for some reason the inventors don't wish that, because they'd like a transfer of rights, or because the due diligence review says this isn't really a patentable piece of work, then we can either decline and not worry about it again and just publish, or we can transfer the rights back to the inventor for them to do with as they wish. Sometimes, very rarely, like once in the years I've been working here, an inventor has said, I disagree with the due diligence review. I think this is patentable. I'm going to patent it myself. And they've gone and done so. And I'm 95% sure that they've wasted their money, but it is also their choice to make. And McGill will always let you do that if you wish. Anyways, so we'll file a provisional patent. I work with dozens of professional patent agents who are very good at writing claims and very good at making sure that we've protected all of the scope that we want to protect. And we'll pay for that. And then we will work down at the bottom here, we'll work with the inventors to commercialize it, that iterative process we talked about. It'll mean attending some meetings, showing your face, smiling, helping the companies be aware about how much more you can provide towards these ideas that you've had that they're looking at on a piece of paper. And As one of the companies we work with that tends to try and commercialize a lot of McGill IP says, they're 80% interested in who the researchers are and if they're nice people, and 20% interested in the research results. Keep that in mind. All right, so then when you're commercializing invention, and I'll be super quick here, I realize I'm pushing my time, Sarah. Canada works a lot on technology transfer and is trying to do better. There are other countries that are better than Canada at pushing the inventions out, and we realize we'd like to do that carefully. And that involves this lovely wheel of information that I won't dwell on. And then we will make that team effort, that iterative process to help work together to commercialize this. And that involves, after the provisional is filed, we actually have a year of time where new results can still get added to the patent before a formal patent is filed. And often myself or some people on my team or the patent agents are able to suggest, if you had this specific result, it would make for a much stronger patent. And if that's something that you think would also strengthen your manuscript, then often the researchers will obtain those results and will file a better patent when the time comes for a formal patent application. Then talk up the invention at conferences, let us know what companies you'd like us to reach out to. And then when we find companies that are interested, and McGill has a series of tech scouts whose job it is actually to make contacts with companies, so that when a researcher says, I think that Siemens Energy might be interested in this technology, the tech scout's like, well, I have 2 contacts at Siemens Energy, let me introduce you to them. So all they do is maintain a huge portfolio of people at companies whose job it is to find technology from universities. And that connection often gives us a big leg up on starting to interact with the company. So last year, this isn't last year, on average, we get 120 inventions a year, and about half of those get protected in some way, and about 75% of those get protected in some way, about half of those get patented. McGill has 60 spin-offs, 60 companies that have been founded based on our technology, about half in life sciences, and those are the ones that are still doing well. There have been many companies that we founded that aren't on this list because they folded for whatever reason, and that happens, and that's okay. 2 of the companies, of the 3 companies I was involved in, are now gone too, and that's okay. And oh, my keyboard is locked. There we go. And this slide is partly here for the Neurosphere, because if researchers do wish to found a spin-off, which is a startup based on McGill technology, McGill has a variety of different avenues through my office that are helpful in order for founding that spin-off. If you wish to look into that, I'm happy to talk to people about it. But generally one-on-one, because you don't want to broadcast what your potential spin-off ideas are to a group of people who you don't know yet. And that leads us to this slide about disclosure. In the world, if you disclose something, as Yanis suggested for NASA, it makes it no longer protectable in a variety of ways. If you write some code yourself, it's copyrighted, it's safe. If you write a novel in Canada, it's copyrighted for your life plus 50 years. If you live in the States, your life plus 70 years, because maybe you die younger because you ate too much of their food. Anyways, so if you disclose something, it often takes away our chance to protect it in some of the ways that exist. And that's why my office would like to hear from you before you submit that manuscript. Let us know that you have something cool. It does not need to be certain that you think it should be patented, that you think that some people are going to want it. We'll look at it with you, we'll talk to you about it, and we'll help you figure out the IP protection strategy that works best for it. But in many cases, we can only do that if it happens before you talked about it at a conference. If you go and talk about it at a conference, a lot of those options are no longer available. So try and avoid that if you can. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was very complete and very interesting.
Chris, a question that I have for you is, you mentioned at the end that, okay, we want to hear from you before you publish, right? But let's say you've published and then you figure out, okay, this can be interesting. So there's still a place where we can reach.
Just because it suddenly accidentally got published does not mean all the avenues are closed. Even for patenting in Canada or Mexico or Australia, the inventors are allowed to file a formal national patent so long as it's less than 1 year after that disclosure happened, if the disclosure was made by the inventors.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, they're even more lenient. So long as you file a patent as the inventor and have made a disclosure, so long as you file a provisional patent within a year, then you can wait an additional year and still protect that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in the extreme case of patenting. But in many cases, you don't need to patent something. I need to stress that often. There's a lot of information about patents in a talk like this because it's the thing that I'm asked most about. You know, I have a couple of slides. Actually, here, I'll share them to help answer your question. I have a couple of slides here that will be given to you about copyright. Copywriting is automatically awarded to you if you write some code. So if in your methodology, Patricia, there's associated code that goes with that, then that is automatically copyrighted and protected. So even though you've disclosed it, it's not like your rights to it are gone. It's not in any case that way. You still own the code to that copyright. What is a problem, like what is potentially an issue is someone could patent the idea of using that, or using code, not your code, because you own that, but using code to apply your methodology in a different way, and then they could start to sell that code. They might not be able to patent it though, because you've put the idea out there by doing so yourself, which is good, but then there's nothing that keeps them from writing their own code that does that and being super good at selling it, and then your many hundred hits that you expect next year might be reduced. In the grand scheme of things though, we live in a world where that sort of competition is actually welcomed. It's good. Because if you start to take advantage of a situation because you're the only person who can do this, then we start to see monopolies and that uncomfortable situation develop. And that's not a great thing in my mind. So yes, there's lots of options that can happen even if it's been disclosed. And there's often, even though things have been disclosed, there are often companies who see that disclosure and are interested in talking to the researcher about that. And then they want to set up some sort of industrial research agreement with that researcher. And then they might say though, but can you make sure you don't disclose the next thing you discover? We'd like to be involved in protecting that. And that's a good step too. And occasionally, I would say once a month, one of the 60 some researchers that I represent, I get an email, or an email comes into McGill that finds its way to me from a company saying, we saw this publication, can we talk to this researcher? And then I set up that meeting. So it's not the end of the world at all if some things have been disclosed. A different thing to be aware of too in patenting, unlike in publications and the way they work these days, patents, the negative results, we tried this and it didn't work, we tried this and it didn't work, those tend to be valuable pieces of information for a company as well. And those are things that are not in your publication.
Yeah.
So that's something else that is of value.
I have another question for Chris, if there's time.
Sure, absolutely.
One of the misconceptions that I had, Chris, is that a patent grants you protection and exclusivity. But in reality, what I later understood is that if there's a big company that wants to do what you're doing, they go ahead and do it, and you have to go legally against them. And if after a long time and a lot of expenses, you win, all you're getting is some royalties, but they can still continue using your invention, correct?
Correct. And so it is rare that a big company, I can name some of the big companies who are happy to infringe on patents and then litigate because it's cheaper. Apple, Samsung, some of those companies, their preference is to actually litigate. But most companies like to play fair in the world. They like to be seen as good players. And so they, rather than you have to go against them, they approach you from the start and figure out how they can get some rights to do this thing that they want to do. Or if you notice, because often the onus is on you to notice that some big company is doing exactly the same thing that you hold a patent to, you can contact them, and don't have your lawyer contact them. That is just the wrong approach. You can find who to contact them. And if McGill owns the patent, McGill will help you contact them and say, look, we actually have the researchers who developed this here, and we hold the IP in this. Are you interested in licensing it? And they'll be like, oh goodness, we've already invested $10 million in this project in our company. We certainly would like to license that because we don't want to get sued later. And they're right. And that's what will happen too in that sort of situation, Yanis. in the situation where litigation occurs, there are organizations, even one in Quebec, something Rock is their name. And what they do is they sort of class action for small companies against big companies. So there are avenues that small companies can use to try and litigate. But honestly, McGill considers itself to be a small company in these situations. And I think there's been a time or two historically ever that McGill has gotten involved in litigation. Mostly patents are in place because, you know, there's hundreds of people you know in the world, and only a couple of them are actually not nice people. The same is true for companies. Most of those companies actually are nice companies as well. And the patent is just a polite way of reminding them that this idea that they thought was theirs was actually first developed by this excellent researcher at McGill. And we'd like you to be aware that this excellent researcher at McGill would like to work with you to make sure that whatever you're developing is even better than you thought.
Thank you, Patricia and Chris, for your interventions and for your talk. It was extremely interesting and very insightful. So the recording of the webinar is going to be available on our website. And again, if you have any other questions or specific questions about your project, feel free to contact Chris or Patricia. So thank you so much again, and have a great rest of your day.